There is no doubt about how important Street Fighter II's video game legacy is, single-handedly rejuvenating the arcade industry and functioning as the blueprint for all fighting games that were to come. Street Fighter II was one of the most impactful and lucrative sequels in history. Prior to this game taking over the world, the series' original from back in 1987 was commercially very successful in its own right. So, between the 4 years that these core entries from the franchise came out, it probably isn't surprising that The World Warrior was not the first title developed to try to stake claim to being Street Fighter's successor. In today's video, we are going to be taking a trip back through time to look at perhaps the most dubious title out there that staked a claim to being the Street Fighter sequel. So let's check out the history of this one and look at if this questionable claim in any way holds up. With all of this said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Human Killing Machine, the real Street Fighter 2. Yeah! In 1987, the arcade populace was graced with an unassuming title, Street Fighter. Capcom's fighting game legacy didn't have an immediate groundswell of support, nor the cultural dominance that later iterations had, but it was a solid game that sold well enough to get some home ports. While these ports wouldn't be found on the Famicom or Mega Drive, NES or Genesis, the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 would get a CD release of the title that was largely accurate to its arcade counterpart. Despite adjustments to the soundtrack and the control scheme being limited to what NEC were offering at the time, a simple 2-button pad, the port was decent for what it was. Known as Fighting Street, this remains the best contemporary port of the title available at the time, but keeping all of this in mind, this was far from the only home version of Street Fighter out there. The computer world would receive a litany of different Street Fighter ports, with each version having to be made bespoke for different computer formats. The Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, DOS, Amiga and Atari ST all received a variation of a title, many of which were developed by Teartex. Teartex were a developer with wild ambitions that may have at points exceeded their skill set. Street Fighter on home computers was a commercial success, so with one debatable win under their belt, US Gold, who had published these Teartex games, decided to propose to Capcom that they could take the lead on producing a proper sequel to Capcom's arcade classic. After all, who doesn't love making more money? In fact, back in 1988, with the future of the Street Fighter franchise up in the air, Capcom were keen to explore their options and continue to profit further off of their new brand. Perhaps the most well-known of these significant planned overhauls of the franchise would be what would come to be known as Final Fight, a title that ditched Ryu and Ken for 3 brawlers who, instead of limiting their battles to one-on-one matches, took their final fight to the streets of Metro City. Known as Street Fighter 89 during test marketing, the game was a drastic diversion to the point that when promoting the game at trade shows, they were advised that the game was so different it didn't really make sense with that name. Capcom then renamed the title to Final Fight, and a new legacy was born. But this still wasn't the end for Capcom producing a Street Fighter sequel pre-1991. Trying again to chase the magic, the Famicom and NES received an action platformer named Street Fighter 2010 for Final Fight. Beyond simple text referring to the main character as Ken, a former Street Fighter in the American release, there's nothing much connecting to the previous game. And as of the time of this video, it only exists as a speed bump in the greater canon. So while carrying the Street Fighter name in its title, the game was as different to the original as it could be. Further to these efforts, a further game that could stake a claim to being Street Fighter sequel was developed by a different company altogether, but at least gameplay wise it was a lot more faithful than Capcom's earlier efforts. I'm referring to SNK's Fatal Fury King of Fighters, which was directed by Takashi Nishiyama and designed by Hiroshi Matsumoto, the same pairing behind Capcom's 87 game, who viewed their next project as its spiritual successor. After the dynamic duo left for what they perceived as the greener pastures of SNK, Capcom's Street Fighter brand had temporarily found itself rudderless without the individuals who led the charge on the original title. Any one of these 3 could be considered the true Street Fighter 2 until Capcom decided to bequeath that title on a proper 1v1 fighter that was released in 1991. Known as Street Fighter II The World Warrior, Capcom came out swinging with a proper sequel that refined every component of the original, expanded the story and cast, and kept Ryu as their iconic star. But as the title of this video suggests, there is yet a further title out there that perceived itself to be the Street Fighter sequel. Before Street Fighter II changed the gaming landscape forever, British company THGM, who we mentioned earlier, decided to try their hand at making their own new entry in the franchise. After all, they had developed home computer ports of the game, so in their eyes, why should they not develop home computer sequels to these ports? US Gold and THGM wanted some more of that sweet Street Fighter cash, so the race was on to make the next Street Fighter game. During this time frame, the THGM team quickly assembled what they would consider the proper sequel to Street Fighter, which was made possible through taking the code they had used to make the first game, then reusing it to make a new one. In fact, they would even go as far as to present this project to Capcom, which raises the question, what would happen in this fateful meeting? Well, drum roll please. Capcom would reject it as Street Fighter II. Without the deal in place THGM wanted, the company were obviously not allowed to carry the Street Fighter brand in this second time around, but they still smelt money from the project and were not willing to let their work go to waste. This meant that the developers proceeded to look into repositioning this new fighting game as their own game franchise. If such a meme format existed over 30 years ago, Human Killing Machine would deliver the We Have Street Fighter 2 at Home result. Published by US Gold for many of the same platforms as their port of Street Fighter, THGM, as it would be shorthanded, replaces Ryu with Quan, a Korean martial artist and the player's only choice of fighter in the roster of 11 characters. The entire cast of Street Fighter is thrown out. Now, as of 2023, more than half of the cast have made playable returns in the official Capcom titles. Ryu, Ken, Sagat, Birdie, Jen, Eagle and Aiden were salvaged for more adventures, while Geki, Mike, Joe, Lee and Retsu would fall by the wayside. Given that these 5 may be the most generic of the cast, it's still a strong statement that 7 of the inaugural combatants were considered worth reviving. The same can't be said for HKM's motley crew of characters, many of which would just not be acceptable in any games in the modern era, unless they were explicitly parodies or mature rated titles like say Thrill Kill or Saints Row. Holding our thoughts about this bizarreness, how does the actual box try to explain the game? The back of the box reads, "He's the meanest son of a snake you've ever seen. He's the human killing machine. Carve out a path of destruction as you battle to stamp your supremacy over a multitude of opponents. Face Igor the Fearless and his rabid dog amongst the sacred temples of Moscow. Don't be fooled by the ladies of the night Maria and Helga, streetwise and toughened in the seedy underworld of Amsterdam. Match the cunning guile of Miguel, master bullfighter, and the unvanquished fighting bull Brutus in the splendid surroundings of the Barcelona bullring. Trade blows with the awesome Titans, Hans, and his drunken compatriot outside a German beerhouse. Finally confront the merciless terrorists of the Middle East amongst the battle-torn ruins of Beirut. Tough and mean, you're the human killing machine." In this bold adventure, Quan faces off against 10 opponents, with pairs of 2 representing one nation. The Soviet Union, villains of the 1980s, are represented by Igor and his dog Shepsky. Igor fights the hunting rifle in front of St. Basil's Cathedral. While Vodka Drunkensky was considered too much of a stereotype for Nintendo, British company THGM decided that a Soviet entering a fight with both a dog and a rifle wouldn't be too over the top. Mortal Kombat's Stryker would be proud to see he wasn't the first combatant to enter a martial arts tournament with modern weaponry. Animal rights activists may be a bit more offended that Quan treats Shepsky like any other fighter, which means that this martial artist will punch and kick this dog until it stops moving. After a successful beatdown of man's best friend, Quan travels to the Netherlands red light district of De Wallen. While the original Street Fighter had no women and Street Fighter 2 only added the iconic Chun-Li, progressive THGM on the other hand brought in a pair of prostitutes, Marie and Helga. God bless 1989. Marie fights in a bikini with boots, while the larger Helga fights in a strapless red number with fishnets. While this title progressively added 2 sex workers, the world at large has sadly forgotten them. But to be fair, at least that very same year, Capcom themselves blessed us with Poison and Roxy. Unfortunately, though, the tier text characters don't seem to have the same amount of fan art dedicated to them that the Capcom pairing carry. Travelling to Spain features a dash more animal cruelty, as Quan's new opponents are the matador Miguel and his bull Brutus. As for the animal combatants in this game, it doesn't help that both Brutus and Shepsky move as if a child is playing with a plastic toy of an animal, and Miguel has nowhere near the style or character as Capcom's own Spanish native would have Vega. While the latter goes into battle with a claw and a mask, Miguel brings his cape and a bullfighting sword to the ring. Miguel follows Igor's example and never actually uses his weapon as intended, which is a shame as this would have been an easy way to explore a ranged character. We then have Hans and Franz. The German Franz is a waiter that attacks via wine bottles, and his cohort Hans is dressed in a stereotypical lederhosen. Franz seems to have the only proper projectile in the game, which is his apparently endless supply of alcoholic beverages. Vodka Drunkensky would be distraught about the destruction of the booze, until he realised it was an inferior German vintage. As this game came out before the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's unclear which specific part of Germany these pair hail from. The final pair of fighters, effectively the Aiden and Sagat of the game, hail from Beirut, Lebanon. Sagan, which is decidedly not Sagat, and Makurva dress in stereotypical garb and fight in front of a tank, which makes sense as Lebanon had been in a civil war for 14 years straight by this point. Makurva brings a rocket launcher to the fight, but like everyone but Franz, there's no projectiles coming from it. Makurva also graces the title card of the game, and while easily the largest character, he goes down as easily as all of the others. Defeating him only allows a player to enter their name in the credits, as Quan gets no post-game epilogue or congratulations. That's the roster, and while it's mostly lazy stereotypes in some aspects, that may have just been par for the course, and something that could be glossed over if the gameplay was particularly solid. That's not the case at all though with Human Killer Machine. It has since gone down as a particularly poor fighter, in modern days with many placing it as one of the worst fighting games of all time. The Bad Game Hall of Fame sums it up perfectly when they state that between completely broken gameplay mechanics, an utter lack of production efforts, and a gameplay progression which sees you kicking dogs on Moscow streets en route to combating terrorists in Beirut, you'll find it hard to believe that this game ever had a snowball's chance in hell at being the sequel to Street Fighter. The game is extremely flawed across the board. Character sprites were large at the cost of the warriors losing the ability to crouch and perform aerial attacks. Quan can accomplish these skills at the trade-off that he'll look permanently bored during the fight. With limited sprites comes limited AI, as opponents will frequently dance at the outer edge of the screen and not rush to challenge the player. The lack of a timer also may encourage this time sink of a fight. Janky hitboxes and a lack of a fireball means Quan must get up close and can potentially get wrecked rather quickly. Quan can recover health by standing still, but his opponents doesn't need to. Most matches will be decided by how many attacks Quan can spam in a few seconds before his opponents decide to randomly perform a killing attack. For tier techs, luckily this title was not a killing blow to their bottom line, as in the following years they would develop a Strider 2 game that was actually officially sanctioned by Capcom, even if their attempt at Street Fighter 2 wasn't. Primarily focused on ports, they played with Disney and Pixar titles for the Game Boy in the mid to late 90s, Nickelodeon in the early 2000s, and eventually petering out with a handful of Game Boy Advance titles and a singular PlayStation 2 game by 2003. A shift to an industrial focus didn't do much to salvage them, and by 2021 they would finally be fully dissolved. As for Human Killing Machine, the title has gone down in history as both terrible and a hilarious curiosity simultaneously, mostly due to the fact that it was at one point pitched to be Street Fighter 2. If US Gold and Tier Tix had have got what they wanted, Street Fighter 2 today would be remembered as an awful game, rather than one of the most revolutionary of all time. So thank God the suits at Capcom had enough foresight to reject this dreadful British game as the second Street Fighter vs Fighter. Still, you may want to give it a shot if you've got France's limited supply of alcohol on hand, or simply fancy a button bashing brawler in Beirut. It will always amuse me to no end that this was supposed to be Street Fighter 2. So ladies and gentlemen, that was Human Killing Machine, the real Street Fighter 2. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you subscribe, then why not check out my upload covering Street Fighter 2010, the first game to carry the Street Fighter brand in post the 1987 original. Yeah! Cheerio.